Good morning, everyone. My name is Alex Master, myself and my co-author from Purdue University, and I'm pleased to be able to present some of the research that we've been doing. So we wanted to look broadly at global internet censorship from a nation-state perspective and talk about internet censorship methods and drawing from a lot of different internet measurement sources that already exist as well as pre-existing literature. So obviously with this crowd we don't need a whole lot of motivation, but nation-state censorship is a hot topic. We can't insulate ourselves from the geopolitical events that happen in our world. Internet freedom is not only happening on its own as its own fight, but a lot of other conflict, COVID, pandemics, everything else affects free and open access to the internet. And so doing this I think is important to be able to highlight and get a global, holistic view as opposed to just doing narrow case studies. And so that's kind of the approach that we wanted to take. And just, again, some more motivation. This is from last year. You can see that the Tor usage data in the Ukraine, you can see that the usage was pretty steady. And then the day that the invasion began, the incursion on the 24th, you can see that the spike in usage. And then proceeding after that, presumably, as the Russian forces proceeded into Ukraine, chopping down towers so there's no LTE access, and then the displacement of civilians. So the research gap that we saw is that we saw that very few studies tended to provide global coverage of internet censorship by nation states, talking about it holistically across the board. And a lot of the case studies that you see are narrow. They have country-specific or they're very time-bound. And so we wanted to do something that could be a global survey. And we traded off some granularity to give that holistic picture. And so just some quick background on nation-state censorship. Most people are probably familiar, but there's really two bins, right? You have the centralized kind. So you may have a nation like Syria, which has like one autonomous system, one AS for the entire nation that's state-controlled. Similarly, a Great Firewall of China. China has a very centralized implementation of its censorship apparatus. And then you also have the decentralized systems. So you'll see in like the Republic of India, you see a lot of individual states that implement DNS block listing differently, internet shutdowns differently, depending on where you are. And then like in the Russian Federation is another example where they basically compel private industry to do censorship on their behalf. And so those are kind of the two bins that we fall into, at least from the literature. And so just some related work, so some things that look like the goals of our topic. So kind of the seminal work was the Access Denied report back in 2008. Their data was from 2006, and they basically said, this is what we believe internet censorship looks like globally from their perspective in there. And they binned it into 4 categories of IP blocking, DNS tampering, block pages, and keywords. Obviously, the internet has changed dramatically since then, and so I think that a second look at this is probably well deserved. And then there was a great SOK paper back in 2016 at Oakland that tried to do some grounding empiricism for censorship circumvention. And so there was one subsection of it that looked very similar to what the goal of our project was, and they called it censorship as practiced. They had 31 measurement studies, and you can see the results in that table up there. Obviously, lacking from our perspective of wanting to be comprehensive and having global representation. And so I bring this up for those unfamiliar. In the United States, in D.C., there's a place called Freedom House. They do a lot of research on democracy, specifically internet freedom. So every year they do a Freedom on the Net report. And so we used the Freedom on the Net report as kind of a basis for our analysis. So the time frame of our study was the exact same time frame as the Freedom on the Net report for 2021. When we did this analysis, it was the end of 2022, so the 2022 report was not yet out. So we used the 2020 report, and we also used the time frame for our study for the first portion of our study. And so you can see kind of the global representation there. And so the idea was that we could take our quantitative analysis, set it up against the qualitative data that Freedom on the Net report has, and compare the two. And this is just another prior work. So this was a study that I did that was for creating a taxonomy for internet censorship, trying to be comprehensive and show these are all the different methods for internet censorship that are currently being used. And so this was the benchmark, essentially. And so you'll see these again on our results page. So for our data collection, the primary two internet measurement data sets that we used was from OONI and also Sensor Planet. Most people are probably familiar. Several people from those projects are here. And so we used those for the cross-sectional study, which was that 1-year period during the Freedom on the Net report. We used the internet measurement data from those. We also drew from peer-reviewed literature, and then for some of the other more qualitative data, we used some other qualitative reports to try and fill in some of the gaps, especially for like internet shutdowns. Most of those are qualitative data. They're being pulled from social media feeds and other things like that, where you don't necessarily have the hard HTTP polls and things that OONI and other platforms can measure. And so the first thing we did was that cross-sectional study. We did the 1-year study for the period on the Freedom of the Net report and did all of that comprehensively. And then we decided that to make it more holistic, we wanted to be able to see what are the trends, what's happening now, and then what's happening over the past 20 years. So what we did was a systematic literature review starting from that 2021 date and going back 20 years to 2001. And we did a systematic literature review of all the literature, of all the nation-state censorship, and documented all of it back to 2001. And so this is what the results look like. This is obviously a little bit hard to see on the screen, but if you go out and look at our paper, you can actually see all of the data. So the column on the left is all of the countries. So Freedom on the Net covers 70 countries, and it's a globally representative sample. And so we used the same countries from the Freedom on the Net report. You can see them dictated there, and it's sorted from their not free status all the way down to free. And then on the top, you can see for the columns, it's headed by all of the qualitative data from Freedom on the Net, and then you can see the different internet censorship methods listed across the top. Of note, we did collapse down. There were 2 from the previous taxonomy that we did not use, so resource exhaustion, things like denial of service attacks we didn't include because those impact everyone on the internet, not necessarily nation states censoring their own citizens. And we also did not include there were two categories that we did not include, the takedowns, so like takedowns of request, denial of service attacks. We did not use either of those. And then we combined IP and port blocking into one category. But other than that, all of the censorship methods are included on there. And so you can see, if you see a filled-in dot, that means that during the cross-sectional study, we actually observed that censorship happening during the study period. If you see a not filled-in dot, that means that it was time-based censorship. It was either like a shutdown that occurred like either overnight or for a certain dedicated period of time during an election or some other period of like civil turmoil. And then if you see a diamond shape, the upside-down triangle, that means it was a historical observation. It happened outside of the dedicated study period, but sometime over the past 20 years. And then anything with a square is unconfirmed, so that means that there may have been a social media post, there may have been some kind of blog post or some qualitative data that suggested that something like this happened, but we didn't actually have any firm evidence or any citation in the literature to support it. And so the results talk about some of the discussions. So 62 out of the 70 surveyed nations had some evidence of internet censorship of some kind. Most popularly was application layer content filtering, so HTTP. Not surprising from the fact that we see this broadly in the literature, but the surprising aspect is with the proliferation of TLS. Most of the websites that you actually browse to today use HTTPS, so those basic URL filtering systems like Blue Coat and some others don't necessarily work that well, but nation states are still willing to go ahead and just continue using these regardless of their efficacy. So even though the systems may not actually work for most of the content, they have them already implemented, they've already done the upfront cost of putting them in, so they continue to use them. And I think unsurprisingly, BGP disruptions were the least utilized method. Usually when something like this happens, like the big examples like Pakistan trying to censor YouTube, when you do that with BGP routing and one autonomous system declares that it's now Google and all traffic in the whole world goes to Pakistan, not great for the global internet, and there's a lot of economic disincentives to mess around with BGP routing. So very rarely does it actually happen for censorship. Usually it's accidental. And this just shows some breakdowns of percentages for you. And again, you can see these in the paper as well. And this is just a visual representation so that you can see that Content filtering indeed was the most prolific, not only during the cross-sectional study period, but also during the systematic review for the past 20 years. And so for trends, we definitely saw a decline in the use of naive IP and port blocking. So obviously, frequently in the past, you would see that places would use like just dedicated IP block lists, but not so much anymore, with two very specific exceptions that I'll talk about because I think they're interesting. So only 6 countries during the study period. IP block lists are a lot less effective now because they're difficult to maintain. The ephemeral nature of IP obviously is one aspect of that. Proliferation of IPv6, it's a very slow process. There's certain nations that have already implemented a wide scale, but not everyone has. But with IPv6, you get an exponential increase in the number of IP addresses that are available out there, and IP block lists are untenable. We also see a lot of issues with collateral damage. So from the censorship community, obviously a good thing. One of the interesting side effects of centralizing a lot of the internet to like Akamai and Cloudflare and a lot of the content delivery networks, if you block one of those like /8 IP spaces, then you block maybe 60% of the internet in that country. And a lot of countries have a large disincentive not to do that. In the rare port blocking, there are 2 major exceptions there. One is Iran. The Republic of Iran is very aggressive in the way that they censor, so they do actually whitelisting, so they allow ports 80, 443, and 53 for DNS and deny everything else. So that's one exception for port blocking. And then they do their censorship in depth from there. So after that deny happens at the edge, they continue filtering from there. But then the other major exception is something that we're seeing in the literature, several reports out about residual censorship. So in Kazakhstan, China, and Iran, actually using blocking where they'll block by some other method, whether it's by DNS filtering or some other method that they'd like to use, and then they start blocking based on a tuple, so either like a source IP and a destination IP, a source IP and port with a destination IP, or it could be a 4-tuple where it's a source IP port, destination IP port. And it'll actually block that for a time-bound set of periods, so anywhere from like 60 to 120 seconds. So it'll block all connections to those endpoints between the 2 endpoints after the initial censorship action happens. We already talked about historical URL filtering, less effective, but they're still in use. And we're also seeing that a lot of the things that were presumed to be too resource intensive for a nation state to implement are very much being implemented. So deep packet inspection happening at the national level is happening all over the place. So any of those assumptions about, oh, it's too resource intensive, a nation state would never implement that, it's not true. And you can see it fleshed out in the data. Also the rise of application targeting. So we've seen it with this Twitter censorship that happened last year in Russia. We also see other nations like Iran that are blocking Signal. They're not always using really advanced techniques to do this. It's usually either endpoint blocking or DNS for now, but we are seeing a lot of specific targeting of like end-to-end encrypted platforms as well as like Tor browser. And then also a rise in internet shutdowns. So 8 over the historic period, but 20 during the case study. So a rise of more nations that are willing to just completely shut down internet access during periods of time. So limitations, delineations for the study. We don't measure quantity. That's not our game. The internet measurement folks, you guys do a great job at tirelessly collecting all of that data and trying to measure throughput. We did not do that. We were basically saying, is there evidence, yes or no, and documenting it. And so that's one limitation of our study. Censorship leakage from autonomous systems we also don't cover. So if, for example, China propagates certain particular IP routing at its edges, and places like Singapore, Indonesia end up getting wrapped up into those routing mechanisms, so they'll actually end up behind the Great Firewall. And so we're not able to necessarily detect when spillage happens over on the global internet, the way that our methodology was constructed. So when one nation state implements a censorship regime and a specific user in a different country gets affected by that, we can't necessarily delineate those things at this time. And then there's also the potential for false positives and ambiguous data points. And I can talk through some of that methodology stuff if people have questions and want to talk about kind of some of the decisions that we made there. And it's outlined in the paper. And then also bias in the research. So a lot of times these, the high-profile offending countries, we had like 35 citations specifically for People's Republic of China. Costa Rica had 0. So is that because Costa Rica doesn't do any censorship, or is that because no researchers are looking into it? It's a valid question. And so looking at how researchers do their research, why they select certain topics. Is it just because it's a offending country? Is it just because of media representation? Is it just because of the research community? These are all valid questions that we need to ask ourselves about just about sampling bias. And then also, I think one other thing to highlight is that most of the time in this community, we get very narrowed in on the fact that censorship is always happening and it's always increasing, but it's not necessarily always the case. So we had 3 examples of nation states that actually had decreases in censorship over that period of time, and I think it's something important to highlight, that it's not always a problem that's ever increasing. Just something to look at. And then for future work, I would love to work with, this involved a lot of manual analysis, a lot of human beings looking with their eyes at HTTP requests and looking through the ONI and Censor Planet data. If we could work together to get some kind of standardized output for that, that would be really awesome. Even if it's just like a JSON or something that we can share across platforms, it would be huge to be able to actually have some standardization in the data so that we could do like automated polls of this rather than having to like go through and have human beings do analysis. Replication studies are always good. We built our study to be able to be easily replicable, so I'm hoping that 3 years from now, 5 years from now, I can go in, mark everything that's in our study right now as historic data, and then just do the diff, and then you could actually see, like, okay, what are the emerging trends globally? And then finally, for practitioners, if we could get encrypted client hellos in TLS 1.3 or 1.4, it would go such a long way at eliminating an entire column of internet censorship methods. Like if we can just get encryption into TLS so that SNI is no longer a factor in the rise of censorship with HTTPS, it would go a long way for increasing the security and privacy of the global internet for everyone. And with that, I'd like to open it up for any questions.
I think based on the rules we have, all the question goes to Zulip. Am I right? Okay, and I'm reading slowly, or yeah, it makes it simpler for our online participants. Perfect. Thank you for the talk. There are quite a bit of questions from you, so I'm going to go through them, and I appreciate brief but complete answers. How do you distinguish between nation-state censorship from something that is done by a private actor, by ROM?
Sure. So thank you for the question. It's very difficult. So if you look at like any internet measurement data set, when you're looking at, so for example with ONI specifically, it's crowdsourced, so anybody that's using the probe is just using it wherever they are, right? So it could be from like an internet cafe, it could be from their place of work, it could be anywhere. And so it is difficult, it's very difficult to distinguish, because when we look at it, we're looking at like the AS level, right? We're just looking at, hey, when this request happened, was it blocked, was it not? And so you have to, for us, there was a proportionality aspect to it. So like, for example, with Censor Planet data, whenever we looked at it and we saw something that was anomalous, right? Because they don't always make a specific determination. If you're served a blocked page, there's lots of lists of block pages out there, and we can see specifically, oh yes, we know this is censorship. And so that was definitely a confirmed yes. If it was something that was anomalous, that was something that looked like for example, like a TCP reset, which is fairly common in a lot of censorship systems. If there was like over 50% of them were TCP resets, then we said, yes, this is indeed censorship. And we also had to make sure that our sample sizes were large. So if there was like an AS specifically that only had like 15 or 20 measurements, whether that was due to underreporting from ONI or whether it was just because we just don't have the data, we would never mark that as censorship. So I think our methodology and approach was on the conservative end of saying that we want to see a lot of data backing up the fact that the censorship is actually happening before we actually mark it as, yes, this is indeed happening. Does that address the question?
I think the question is nation state versus just some ISP going rogue.
So, I mean, they're one and the same. I mean, from one aspect of it, they are one and the same. So whenever you have like a nation state compelling it to do censorship on their behalf, then it's indeed censorship. If it was a private actor in, like, say, Iceland or somewhere where there's very minimal censorship going on, it's difficult to distinguish. And for us as analysts, we had to just go in and make. That was a kind of a subjective call, right? Like because if you go in and you see a block page that's like University of something doesn't want you to do this, then that would not actually be indicative of censorship. And that's why having like some of the human element of it was beneficial for us, at least, because it's a difficult thing to distinguish with an automated system.
How do the findings from Freedom of Net diverge from the measurement data, or the discrepancies in them?
That's a great question, and it's something that we have looked at for future research as well. I think that by and large, they matched, but there were several interesting exceptions. So, like, for example, the United Kingdom falls very, very low on the scoring, on the freedom score. Like, they have a very good freedom score from Freedom on the Net. But when you actually dig into the data, there's several instances of censorship. Notably, like in 2009, the London police shut off the internet and all the tubes when there was like environmental protests going on. And that's, a boo-boo from a nation-state perspective of like them actually denying access to the internet. And there are several other countries like that. There was Canada that had a COVID-19 mishap with denying access to COVID-19 information online. There were several other countries that fell very low on the list that you can see actually had several instances of censorship occurring. So I'll say, like, on the whole, qualitatively they matched up, but there were several interesting things that I think our data fleshed out.
Did you reach out to them to know exactly what methodology Freedom of Net uses on the back end, like what they actually do? I mean, they have a website explaining it, but did you guys get to know them? I
didn't reach out to talk to them, but their methodology is pretty clear. Qualitatively, they do like 120 questions over 3 different broad categories with subsections, and overall it's like 120 qualitative questions that they ask to be able to measure those. Yeah.
Boya Wang asked, in the table, do you consider content moderation or content keyword filtering as a censorship as well? Why or why not?
No. So the perspective that we took on it was network manipulation, and so that's the frame of mind that we came at it. So anything that's like done by like content moderation from a social media company, a big tech company. There's some great research going on from like Weibo and some other platforms in China. We did not touch anything about like content moderation or filtering it from the server side. This was all about just network manipulation.
I think due to the time constraint we have, I'm just going to give Arturo, our only representative, to ask the last question.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, no, I mean, I found very surprising the fact that in 2021 was the study period.
Yes.
That the most prevalent form of blocking is HTTP, URL, or keyword based.
Yes.
And I was wondering if you had, some hypothesis as to why that might be the case. And if you also looked at whether, when you do see that it's HTTP keyword based, do they also use other methods on top of it, or is it just that? Or are people in these like networks able to just circumvent by using the HTTPS site? And also if you were considering in this category, like SNI-based filtering, would it be classified as that as well, or not?
So TLS-based filtering was its own category, so that was separately categorized. For HTTP, I think, so my hypothesis, and I mentioned it briefly in the talk, but my hypothesis is that these systems are already in place, and so even if they're ineffective systems, a lot of these countries just still continue using them. But it is interesting to see that they're because these are easily bypassed, right? Like these are very easy to get around. Like just literally using HTTPS is able to bypass most of those content filters. There are many of the nations, I can't give you a number off the top of my head, but if we look at the chart, we can kind of give you a rough estimate of there are many nations that if they use HTTP based, they also use other ones. So there are not many countries that only use like content filtering. They use many others as well.
Right, but you would have to do it on the same network because that somebody in that country is using a different technique does not necessarily mean that on that specific network in that country they're using another technique as well.
Sure, that's true. Yes.
I think
No. Yeah.
you have something.
No, go ahead.
The issue of censorship analysis, especially in the topic that we're discussing, warrants a dialogue. So we can stick around in our breaks.
Yeah, absolutely.
And discuss. I think there are issues, like there are topics brought up that is lovely in a coffee break, and we can go through them. But our talks are limited, so I'm
Okay.
going to thank you for your talk. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.